In this video, I'm going to walk through two solutions to an interesting post I saw in the Power BI community. And each of them, I think, shows a good tip in Power Query, and so that's why I wanted to share both. So I'm going to jump over to Query Editor and set this up. The post was about, that someone brought in their data, it doesn't really matter the source, and basically they had more columns in this, but basically the challenge was, hey, I need to remove only the first zeros in my data, but there's other zeros in my data that I need to keep, right? And so a simple filter to remove zeros wouldn't solve the problem. And so actually came up with two ways to do this. The second one is probably the one I'd recommend. It looks to be a little bit more performant as well when I scale this up, but both are good tips to know. So the first one involves using a group by. Now, if I go ahead and group by this column, and I'm going to start out by just keeping all the rows, which is a really useful trick to know when you're doing group bys for some solutions. And you can see it grouped all of the rows that have a zero value together, right? So I've got all these rows. So that isn't what I want, but there is a variation on the group by function where I can add a group kind out here. I'm going to do GroupKind.Local. And what that's going to do that is it actually groups rows whenever there's a change in the value. So with this, I'm able to separate the initial zeros from those later zeros in the data. And so from here, it's pretty straightforward. So then I can just say, okay, now I want to remove the top rows, and I'll just remove the top row from this table of tables. And from here, now I can move those other columns and then just expand everything back out. And I've got my desired result. And so, of course, that would work dynamically as well, because it's going to group those initials rows together. Okay, so that's solution number one. And so, knowing when to use or just being aware that this GroupKind.Local is out there comes in handy in some situations like that one. The second one's a little more tricky, but it's also good to understand. And so this one is going to use List.PositionOf. And the person that posted it did say they played with this and wasn't able to get it working because this one is a little tricky. You have to use one of the later parameters in the function. And so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, so I'm going to just do add a step here. So that references the previous step. And I actually just want the value column as a list. And so when I do that, I actually get a list that shows all those values. Okay, so now I'm going to do list.positionOf. Okay. And for here, you could just say, I want to look for a zero, right? And that would come back with a zero as the answer. It is a zero-based count. But that's not what I want. And I'm going to set an occurrence first on this one. And then the tricky part here, and this actually I got from one of Chris Webb's articles where it explains the last term of the list.positionOf. Should have shown that first, but another useful trick here is if I just do a blank query, and you can go to the Power BI documentation site, or you can just type the name of a function in here, and you can get this documentation here. And so I just put in this occurrence term, and that's how I knew what to put there. I chose occurrence first. But this equation criteria is the term that's a little trickier, and that's what I read Chris's article about, and it showed how to use that. And so with that one, you can basically say, I'm going to create a function that has two input parameters, so I could call them anything. And then you do the equals greater than to create a function. And then I'm just looking for something that returns true here. And so now if I say x does not equal y, I want to get the first non-zero. So I'm going to go ahead and try that. And so what that's going to do is iterate through each value of the list, and it's going to compare if it equals this. So this is the Y, and the X value is changed. So if I do that, then I correctly found that it's the 11th row, again, starting counting at 0, that is where my first non-zero is. So now what I can do is just do a remove top rows, so table.skip. Then it's my change type. I'm going to reference the step before my previous one, and then just use this custom one, which is my value for 10, and I get the same result again, where it starts at 11. And so if I change my input parameter here and say I change that to 6, right, then you'll see that it correctly removes the first 6 rows and lets me start at 7. And the other one does the same. So just two useful tricks to know in Power Query. One, the GroupKind.Local for doing groups, group bys, and then the equation criteria that is an available term on a number of list functions, including List.PositionOf.